What if I told you that a French firefighter held Princess Diana's hand in her final moments and kept her deepest secrets for 20 years? What if I told you that this man, Xavier Gourmelon, just broke his silence and revealed the 5 words Diana spoke as she lay dying in a Paris tunnel? This isn't just another story about Diana's tragic death. This is the untold account of the last person to speak with the people's princess, a hero who tried desperately to save her life and has been haunted by her final words ever since. For 2 decades, military law forbade him from speaking. Now, he's ready to tell the world what really happened in those final moments. If you want to honor Diana's memory and discover the truth that's been hidden for decades, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. The story you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about Princess Diana's final moments. August 31st, 1997, 12:27 a.m., Paris Fire Station. Xavier Gourmelon was settling into what should have been a quiet Saturday night shift when the call came through the fire station's emergency radio. At 29 years old, with several years of experience as a Parisian firefighter, he had responded to countless accidents in his career, but nothing could have prepared him for what awaited him in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. "Emergency call, vehicle collision in the underpass, multiple casualties," crackled the dispatcher's voice through the radio at exactly 12:27 a.m. Xavier and his 10-man team immediately sprang into action, their fire truck screaming through the empty streets of central Paris. The City of Light was sleeping, unaware that history was about to be made in its darkest corners. "We were very close to there, and it took less than 3 minutes to reach the tunnel," Xavier would later recall. As they approached the scene, the acrid smell of twisted metal and burning rubber filled the air. The sight that greeted them was devastating: a mangled black Mercedes-Benz, its front end completely destroyed after colliding with the tunnel's 13th concrete pillar. Xavier's training kicked in immediately. "The car was in a mess, and we just dealt with it like any road accident," he remembered. "We got straight to work to see who needed help and who was alive." His practiced eyes quickly assessed the scene. 2 bodies in the front were clearly beyond help. The driver slumped over the steering wheel, and another man whose injuries were too severe for survival. But in the back seat, Xavier spotted something that gave him hope. A blonde woman was moving slightly, her eyes flickering open and closed. She was conscious, breathing, and very much alive. In that moment, Xavier had no idea he was looking at the most famous woman in the world. To him, she was simply a victim who needed his help. The woman was lying on the floor of the back seat, having been thrown from her position during the impact. The woman, who I later found out was Princess Diana, was on the floor in the back. She was moving very slightly, and I could see she was alive, Xavier recalled. Her blonde hair was disheveled, her elegant black outfit torn, but there was something almost ethereal about her even in this moment of crisis. What struck Xavier most was how calm she appeared despite the chaos surrounding them. There was no blood on her face, no obvious signs of the internal trauma that would prove fatal. I could see she had a slight injury to her right shoulder, but other than that, there was nothing significant. There was no blood on her at all, he would later explain. As Xavier approached the wrecked vehicle, he could hear the distant sound of photographers already gathering at the scene. The paparazzi who had been chasing the car were now documenting its aftermath, their camera flashes creating an eerie strobe light effect in the tunnel. But Xavier blocked out all distractions. His focus was entirely on the injured woman who needed his help. He reached through the twisted metal and debris to make contact with her. When his hand touched hers, he felt a slight squeeze, a sign that she was not just alive, but aware of his presence. In that touch, a connection was formed that would haunt Xavier for the rest of his life. What happened next would reveal Diana's final words, words that would echo through eternity and change everything Xavier thought he knew about life, death, and the weight of being the last person to hear a legend speak. August 31st, 1997, 12:30 a.m., inside the wreckage. Xavier Gourmelon carefully maneuvered through the twisted wreckage, his experienced hands finding safe passage around the jagged metal and shattered glass. The woman's eyes were open now, looking directly at him with a clarity that surprised him given the severity of the accident. Her gaze was alert, almost searching, as if trying to understand where she was and what had happened. I held her hand and tried to calm her down, Xavier recalled, his voice filled with the memory of that moment. He spoke to her in English, his French accent thick but his words clear and reassuring. "Stay calm. Everything will be all right. The ambulance is coming. You're going to be okay." As he knelt beside the wreckage, Xavier began his assessment. Years of emergency response had taught him to look for specific signs: the color of the victim's skin, their breathing pattern, the focus in their eyes. What he saw gave him hope. Despite being involved in a high-speed collision that had killed 2 people instantly, this woman seemed remarkably stable. She was conscious and had her eyes open, he remembered. I didn't believe she was in any real danger since she was conscious and her eyes were open. Her breathing was steady, if a bit labored, and she responded to his touch. Xavier began preparing to extract her from the vehicle, confident that once she reached the hospital, she would make a full recovery. That's when she spoke. The woman looked directly into Xavier's eyes and in clear English asked him 5 words that would haunt him forever. "My God, what's happened?" The question hit Xavier like a physical blow. There was something profound in those words, not just confusion about the accident, but a deeper bewilderment about life itself. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying an accent that spoke of education and refinement. She wasn't asking about her physical condition or demanding to know about the others in the car. She was asking the eternal question that philosophers and theologians have pondered for centuries: what has happened to the world, to life, to us? Diana said to me, "My God, what's happened?" Xavier would later recount, the memory still vivid decades later. I could understand her English, so I tried to calm her down. I was holding her hand. In that moment, Xavier became the last person to engage in conversation with Princess Diana. He didn't know it then, but he was witnessing the end of an era, the final words of a woman who had captivated the world, challenged the monarchy, and redefined what it meant to be royal in the modern age. She seemed agitated, Xavier remembered, so I attempted to calm her down. He squeezed her hand gently and continued speaking in his accented English, telling her that help was on the way, that she was going to be all right, that she just needed to stay calm and breathe steadily. The woman seemed to accept his reassurance. Her eyes remained focused on his face, as if drawing strength from his presence. For those precious moments, in the aftermath of violence and chaos, there was a human connection between a French firefighter and the people's princess. 2 strangers brought together by tragedy, sharing what neither knew would be their final conversation. Xavier began preparing to extract her from the wreckage, confident in his assessment that her injuries were manageable. He had no way of knowing that Diana was already dying from internal injuries that weren't immediately visible, that every second that passed was bringing her closer to the end. What happened next would transform Xavier's confidence into a nightmare, and Diana's seemingly stable condition into a race against time that they would ultimately lose. August 31st, 1997, 12:35 a.m. The extraction, Xavier Gourmelon moved with practiced precision, his team working in perfect synchronization around the mangled Mercedes. Years of emergency response had taught them that speed was essential. But so was care. One wrong move during an extraction could turn a survivable injury into a fatal one. As they prepared to lift Diana from the wreckage, Xavier maintained constant communication with his patient. "I gave her some oxygen," he recalled, "and my team and I stayed by her side as she was taken out of the car. The oxygen mask seemed to help stabilize her breathing, and Diana's eyes remained alert and focused. Xavier felt increasingly confident about her chances of survival. In his experience, crash victims who remained conscious and responsive usually made full recoveries. The extraction process was surprisingly smooth. It was quick because we didn't have to cut any wreckage, Xavier explained. Unlike many car accidents where firefighters must use heavy equipment to free trapped victims, Diana had been thrown clear of the major structural damage. They were able to lift her out through the back door opening without having to dismantle parts of the vehicle. Diana remained conscious throughout the process, occasionally squeezing Xavier's hand when he offered reassurance. Her breathing was steady, her responses appropriate. Every indicator suggested that she would survive this accident. Xavier had seen much worse injuries in victims who went on to make complete recoveries. But as they placed her on the stretcher, something changed. When Gourmillon and others lifted her from the back seat and onto a stretcher, she suffered cardiac arrest, the medical reports would later state. But in that moment, all Xavier knew was that the woman who had been talking to him just minutes earlier suddenly went limp. Her eyes, which had been so alert and focused, rolled back. Her steady breathing became irregular gasps, then stopped entirely. The hand that had been squeezing his in reassurance went completely limp. In an instant, Diana went from being a stable patient to someone fighting for her life. At that moment, the doctor said she was in cardiac arrest, Xavier remembered. So we gave her CPR, and after 20 seconds she regained consciousness and we transferred her to the ambulance. The next 20 seconds were the longest of Xavier's career. He positioned his hands over Diana's heart and began chest compressions, counting out the rhythm that had become second nature to him. I massaged her heart, and a few seconds later she started breathing again, he recalled. It was a relief, of course, because as a first responder, you want to save lives. And that's what I thought I had done. Diana's eyes fluttered open again, and she took a deep, shuddering breath. Color returned to her cheeks, and her pulse strengthened under Xavier's fingers. The crisis seemed to have passed as quickly as it had begun. Xavier felt a surge of professional satisfaction. He had pulled her back from the brink of death. To be honest, I thought she would live, he would later admit. As far as I knew when she was in the ambulance, she was alive, and I expected her to live. Diana was conscious again, breathing on her own and responding to stimulus. By every measure Xavier knew, she was going to survive. As they loaded her into the ambulance, Xavier felt confident that he had just saved a life. It was only then that one of the paramedics approached him with information that would change everything. It was only when she had been put into the ambulance that one of the paramedics told me it was her. The blonde woman whose hand he had held, whose final words he had heard, was Princess Diana. August 31st, 1997, 1:25 a.m., en route to hospital. The paramedic's words hit Xavier like a thunderbolt. That's Princess Diana. He stared at the man in disbelief, then looked back at the ambulance that was already pulling away from the scene. The blonde woman he had just rescued, whose hand he had held, whose life he thought he had saved, was the most famous woman in the world. I was so shocked, Xavier would later confess. I knew who she was, but I don't follow British royalty closely. I went to the ambulance and looked in, and that's when I recognized her. Even in her injured state, there was something unmistakably regal about her. The bone structure, the elegant features that had graced magazine covers around the globe. The reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. This wasn't just any car accident victim. This was Diana, Princess of Wales, the mother of the future King of England, the woman who had revolutionized the monarchy, the people's princess beloved by millions. And she had just spoken her final words to him, a working-class French firefighter. As the ambulance raced through the streets of Paris toward Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital, Xavier remained at the crash site, dealing with the aftermath of the accident. But his mind was on the woman in the ambulance. The whole episode is still very much in my mind, he would later reflect, and the memory of that night will stay with me forever. The scene around Xavier was chaotic. Police were questioning witnesses, photographers were being held back, and investigators were already beginning to piece together what had happened. The world's media was descending on Paris like a swarm of locusts, drawn by the magnitude of the story. But all Xavier could think about were Diana's 5 words. My God, what's happened? At 1:25 a.m., exactly 58 minutes after the crash, the ambulance carrying Diana arrived at the hospital. Xavier didn't know it yet, but the princess was already in critical condition. The cardiac arrest at the scene had been a sign of massive internal bleeding that wasn't immediately visible to first responders. Xavier completed his duties at the crash site and returned to the fire station, confident that he had helped save Princess Diana's life. I expected her to live, he recalled, but I found out later she had died in hospital. It was very upsetting. At approximately 4:00 a.m., after nearly 2 hours of desperate surgery, Diana was declared dead. The news reached Xavier like a physical blow. The woman whose hand he had held, who had looked directly into his eyes and spoken her final words, had died despite his best efforts. I know now that there were serious internal injuries, but the whole episode is still very much in my mind, he would later say. Diana had suffered what doctors call traumatic rupture of the left pulmonary vein, essentially a tear in the major blood vessel leading to her heart. This type of injury is often invisible to first responders because the bleeding occurs internally. She had been slowly bleeding to death even as Xavier held her hand and reassured her that everything would be all right. The irony wasn't lost on Xavier. He had successfully resuscitated her at the scene, had restored her heartbeat and breathing, had given her those precious extra minutes of life. But Diana's injuries were simply too severe for modern medicine to overcome. As dawn broke over Paris on August 31, 1997, the world woke up to the news that would shock a generation. Princess Diana was dead, and somewhere in a Paris fire station, Xavier Gourmillon was grappling with the weight of being the last person to hear her voice. August 31, 1997, 6:03 a.m., the world changes forever. Xavier Gourmillon sat in the Paris fire station as the world erupted around him. Television screens across the globe were broadcasting the same devastating news. Diana, Princess of Wales, was dead at the age of 36. The woman whose hand he had held just hours earlier, who had looked into his eyes and asked, "My God, what's happened?" was gone. The weight of her final words pressed down on Xavier like a physical force. "My God, what's happened?" wasn't just a question about the accident. It seemed to encompass something much deeper, something prophetic. Had Diana somehow sensed that her time was ending? Was she asking about more than just the crash in the tunnel? "I can still picture the whole scene," Xavier would later say. "It's something I'll never forget, and that I always think about at this time of year." But in those first hours after Diana's death was announced, Xavier was bound by military law to remain silent. As a member of the French military fire service, he was forbidden from speaking to the media about what he had witnessed. The phone at the fire station rang constantly. Reporters from around the world were trying to reach anyone who had been at the scene. Xavier watched his colleagues field call after call, all asking the same questions. What happened in the tunnel? What were Diana's final moments like? How did she die? Xavier knew the answers. He had been there. He had held her hand, heard her voice, looked into her eyes as life slowly ebbed from her body, but he couldn't tell anyone. "As a fireman, you are part of the French military, so you are forbidden to talk," he would later explain. "Now I have left the fire service and I felt it was okay." Meanwhile, across the English Channel, Diana's sons, Prince William and Prince Harry, were waking up to the devastating news at Balmoral Castle. The boys who had spoken to their mother just the day before, who had rushed her off the phone to return to their games, were now orphaned. The guilt that Xavier felt for not being able to save Diana was nothing compared to the regret those boys would carry for the rest of their lives. The global outpouring of grief was unprecedented. Flowers began appearing at Kensington Palace, Buckingham Palace, and even at the British Embassy in Paris. People stood in the rain, weeping for a woman they had never met but felt they knew intimately. Diana had touched millions of lives through her charity work, her openness about mental health, and her obvious love for her children. But Xavier knew something that none of those mourners did. He knew Diana's actual final words, not the sanitized version that would eventually emerge in official reports. He knew the confusion and bewilderment in her voice, the way she had squeezed his hand as if anchoring herself to life. He knew that in her final conscious moments, she had been trying to understand what was happening to her world. The question, "My God, what's happened?" would haunt Xavier for decades. It seemed to capture not just Diana's confusion about the accident, but perhaps her bewilderment at the chaos her life had become. The divorce, the media scrutiny, the paparazzi chase that led to her death. What had happened to the fairy tale princess who had married Prince Charles in front of 750 million television viewers? Xavier went home that morning carrying a secret that he couldn't share with anyone, not even his wife. He had held Princess Diana's hand as she died, had been the last person to hear her voice, had tried desperately to save her life, and for the next 20 years he would have to live with that knowledge in silence. The burden of those final words, "My God, what's happened?" would stay with him forever. August 31st, 2017, the truth finally revealed. 20 years passed before Xavier Gourmelon could finally tell the world what really happened in Princess Diana's final moments. 2 decades of carrying the weight of her last words. 2 decades of watching the world speculate about her death while he held the truth inside. "This is the first time I have spoken to the media," Xavier said in 2017, when he finally broke his silence in an interview with the Sun newspaper. "As a fireman, you are part of the French military, so you are forbidden to talk. Now I have left the fire service and I felt it was okay." By 2017, Xavier was 49 years old, retired from firefighting, and working as the head of emergency services at Brest Airport in France. The young man who had rushed into the Pont de l'Alma tunnel on that fateful night was now middle-aged, graying at the temples, carrying the wisdom that comes from years of saving lives and witnessing death. But Diana's case was different. It haunted him in ways that no other emergency call ever had. "I know now that there were serious internal injuries, but the whole episode is still very much in my mind, and the memory of that night will stay with me forever," he confessed. When Xavier finally revealed Diana's final words, "My God, what's happened?" the world understood for the first time the profound nature of her last moments. These weren't the words of someone in physical pain or calling for help. They were the words of someone trying to comprehend the incomprehensible, to make sense of a life that had spiraled beyond her control. Xavier's revelation cast new light on Diana's final years. The woman who had revolutionized the monarchy, who had brought warmth and humanity to the rigid world of royalty, who had used her fame to champion causes from landmine removal to AIDS awareness, had been reduced to asking a stranger in a tunnel, "My God, what's happened?" The firefighter's account also revealed the tragic irony of Diana's death. "To be honest, I thought she would live," Xavier admitted, "but I found out later she had died in hospital. It was very upsetting." He had successfully resuscitated her at the scene, had restored her breathing and heartbeat, had given her hope of survival. Diana had been conscious and speaking when she arrived at the hospital. Her death wasn't immediate. It was a slow tragedy that unfolded over hours. Xavier's decision to finally speak out was motivated by more than just his retirement from the fire service. 20 years had passed. Prince William and Prince Harry had grown into men, and they had begun speaking openly about their mother's death and its impact on their lives. Xavier felt that the world deserved to know the truth about Diana's final moments, to understand that she hadn't died alone and afraid, but in the hands of people who were trying desperately to save her. "I held her hand and tried to calm her down," Xavier remembered. "She looked at me and said, 'Oh my God, what's happened?' I told her to stay calm, that everything would be all right." In those final conscious moments, Diana had been comforted by a stranger who became her guardian angel. a working-class French firefighter who treated her not as royalty but as a human being in need of help. Xavier's revelation transformed our understanding of Diana's death from a story of paparazzi pursuit and royal tragedy into something more intimate and profound. Her final words, "My God, what's happened?" became a universal question about life's fragility, about how quickly everything can change, about the human need to understand our place in the cosmic order. The man who held Princess Diana's hand as she died had finally given the world the gift of truth, 20 years too late but still precious in its honesty. Xavier Gourmelon's courage to finally break his silence after 20 years gives us the most intimate and authentic account of Princess Diana's final moments. His revelation that her last words were, "My God, what's happened?" transforms our understanding of her death from a distant tragedy into a deeply human story about life's fragility and our search for meaning in chaos. This French firefighter, who held Diana's hand as she lay dying, reminds us that in our final moments we're all simply human beings seeking comfort and understanding. Diana's last question wasn't about her royal status or her fame. It was the eternal human question we all ask when faced with life's most overwhelming challenges. If Xavier's story touched your heart and helped you see Diana not as an untouchable icon, but as a woman who needed comfort in her darkest hour, please subscribe to keep her memory alive through truth, not mythology. Hit the notification bell so you never miss these untold stories that reveal the real person behind the royal title. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that compassion and human connection matter more than fame or fortune. Remember Diana's legacy, that we all deserve to be treated with dignity in our most vulnerable moments. Thank you for honoring Diana's memory by seeking truth over sensationalism. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most powerful stories are told by ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances.